In Acts chapter 15, the Jerusalem Council is trying to decide what to do about the Mosaic Code and what role it plays in the modern church, particularly with the Gentiles, who are not used to growing up with the Mosaic Code. And many of the Jews, specifically the Judaizers, were trying to convince the Gentiles that they needed to follow the Mosaic Code. I'm sure some were more strict than others, but Peter, at the council, addresses the idea that you need to follow the Mosaic Code in order to be saved, in order to get into heaven, in order to be justified before God. He confronts that idea that the law is used in such a way to be justified before God, and rejects it, and says that it's not necessary. It's quite the burden to be placing on Gentiles. But the council still has to decide, okay, if the Mosaic Code doesn't play a role in justification, what role then, if any, does it play? James's decision, consistent with Peter and along with the rest of the council, is to give out a letter to the churches about what to do. The letter basically says that the Judaizers who were teaching this were not coming from instruction of the council. James distances himself with the council from the teaching of the Judaizers. He doesn't say that they shouldn't follow the Mosaic Code. He just said that wasn't our instruction. And then, after saying that, he proceeds to give them some laws, some things to follow, a miniature version of following the law, a Mosaic Code 101, if you will, a starter kit. They distance themselves from the pedagogy of the Judaizers. Paul talks about, in his Corinthian letter, the necessity of starting with milk in the neophyte stage of the Christian walk, and then growing up out of childhood into maturity, and finally chewing down on some meat. It's all an analogy for growing in your knowledge and life as a Christian. Well, that focus was in view at the Jerusalem Council when their letter was starting them with milk, and they were distancing themselves from the pedagogy of the Judaizers because the Judaizers wanted to throw meat on these Gentile children and these spiritual children of the Gentile church, and throwing the entire law on them at once when they weren't ready for it, right? That doesn't mean they were saying the law was wrong. In fact, they gave a law with the letter to follow. And then he says, if you do these things, you're doing well. Paul, James, and Peter didn't think that was the culmination of the ethical life of the Christian. They clearly thought that there was more to grow into, right? Because all of them end up writing letters of instruction to the church beyond those laws to follow in their own epistles to the church, which just shows me that they said, if you follow these things, you have done well for yourself so far, right? That's the understanding, that so far you've done well. The law itself that they gave, those things saying, don't commit adultery, sexual immorality, these are things that can be deduced from the Mosaic Code itself. So it's a starter kit, a 101 Mosaic Code that they're giving them so that they don't overburden the Gentile church. There's some great work on what these things are in the letter of the Jerusalem Council. Well, if you put all those things together, sexual morality, things strangled, from blood, from idolatry, these are all things that were happening in the pagan temples of the day and age, of the time. There was idolatry, worshiping of the pagan gods through means of sexual immoral practices, through rituals that involved sexual rites, animals, and straining the blood out. These are all part of the pagan practices that were occurring in the temples, right? So they were instructing Gentiles to distance themselves from those pagan rituals involving all these matters to get away from the idolatry. Their instructions then were not given with an idea that this is the exhaustive list of the ethics that a Christian should follow. No. What's interesting is that in the Jerusalem letter, they give instructions to stay away from blood, things strangled, sexual idolatry, sexual immorality, but they don't explicitly say to just stay away from the pagan temples, in and of themselves. They say what happens at the temples, in the temples, and says stay away from those things specifically. which if you were to follow those things, right, as the New Testament church abided by those prohibitions, what was included in those prohibitions was blood and things strangled, which automatically makes the New Testament Christian, the Gentile church, a non-participant in Jewish sacrifices, in Jewish practices that were coming from the sacrificial system of the Old Testament law. It didn't do away with the Old Testament law as a whole, but it did do away with a sacrificial part to stay away from blood, right? And that has a consequence on the question of circumcision specifically. But that's for another time. It doesn't do away with the sacrificial system as if it's not important or we can't learn from it. It just says that we observe that sacrificial system in a different way than how they observed it in the Old Testament, because we believe Christ fulfilled the sacrificial system, right? It doesn't mean those laws aren't important, but when we observe Christ's sacrifice and his spilt blood, that is, in effect, observing the importance of those laws, right? It's observing the necessity of the requirements of those laws because Christ fulfilled the requirements of those laws. We think they're very important because if they weren't important, Christ didn't have to sacrifice his blood. We just are doing away with them in the sense that we don't have to sacrifice new animals or new blood on any altar because it's already been done, and perfectly so. We don't want to sacrifice anew because to do that would be to reject Christ. And to observe Christ on the cross is to observe the import of those laws. So you're not doing away with them, you're just observing them in a different way. Canon Press does a great release and study on how the Old Testament law works, especially in the life of the Christian today. Is definitely something you should check out. Pastor Doug Wilson with Canon Press, great stuff on that. The point being, this isn't a time to give meat to babies. This is a time to give milk to babies. And then have them grow up in instruction and doctrine to be able to handle meat, right? And right now, one of the milk doctrines that the Jerusalem Council is teaching is you cannot serve two masters. You cannot follow two gods. You cannot follow Christ and participate in pagan ritual practices. So, step one, do away with those pagan ritual practices.